December 7, 1941. The skies above Pearl Harbor filled with small aircraft, the rising sun symbol painted on their wings. Agile, deadly silhouettes sliced through the clouds, leaving trails of destruction and chaos. These were the Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, planes that moved with an almost supernatural precision, piloted by men who considered themselves the living extension of the samurai spirit. The Western world, particularly the United States, faced for the first time the physical manifestation of what would become its nightmare in the Pacific skies. When we saw those Zeros maneuvering, it was like we were facing something magical, supernatural, an American pilot who survived the attack later reported. They turned at impossible angles, accelerated when they seemed to be losing speed. It was as if they defied the very laws of physics. This almost mystical perception of the Zero was no accident. The relationship between the Japanese pilot and his aircraft transcended mere technical or operational mastery. It was a manifestation of what Carl Jung, in his work Man and His Symbols, would describe as the projection of a collective archetype, that of the divine warrior, protected by the gods and destined for victory. Japanese pilots didn't just fly their Zeros, they merged with the machine in a deep psychic process that Jung would call mystical participation. In the words of Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's flying aces who survived the war, "When we flew, it wasn't just our body commanding the aircraft, it was our soul, our spirit. The Zero responded to our thoughts even before we moved the controls." This description, far from being merely poetic, reveals a profound psychological phenomenon: identification with an external object to such an extent that the boundaries between the self and the object begin to dissolve. During the early years of the war in the Pacific, the Zero reigned supreme in the skies. Statistics from the era show that in initial engagements, a Zero could shoot down between 3 and 4 Allied aircraft for every Zero lost. This technical superiority further reinforced the psychic mythology built around the aircraft and its pilots. As Jung would teach us, when a collective belief is repeatedly confirmed by experience, it crystallizes into the collective unconscious, becoming almost an axiomatic truth. Japanese pilots, especially those trained before the war, had undergone a rigorous process that not only shaped their technical skills but also their psyche. Japanese aviation training was notoriously severe, with elimination rates reaching 90% in some classes. This process was not just to select the most skilled, but also to forge a specific mindset, that of the warrior who transcends the fear of death, who sees himself as an instrument of the imperial will. Jung, in his studies on psychology and Eastern religion, noted how certain traditions manage to integrate transcendent experiences into the everyday psyche. In the case of Japanese pilots, the concept of Bushido, the warrior's path, and the belief in the emperor's divinity created a psychic structure where death in combat was not just acceptable but desirable as the supreme form of honor. This conditioning created what Jung would call an autonomous complex, a psychic structure that operates independently of conscious will. However, every light casts a shadow, and the brighter the light, the denser the shadow that forms. The Zero's supremacy in the Pacific skies had its dark side, its own psychic shadow, arrogance, tactical inflexibility, and most importantly, the denial of any possibility of American technological superiority. As Jung wrote in Psychology and Alchemy, that which we deny in consciousness ends up confronting us as fate. And fate arrived in the form of a robust, powerful, and technologically advanced aircraft, the F6F Hellcat. Developed specifically to neutralize the Zero's advantages, the Hellcat began arriving in the Pacific theater of operations in mid-1943. With its superior armor, heavier armament, and ability to match or surpass the Zero in various aspects of performance, the Hellcat represented more than a tactical threat. It was a direct confrontation with the psychic mythology built by the Japanese. The first losses were attributed to pilot error or unfavorable circumstances. "It's impossible for an American machine to surpass our Zero," a Japanese squadron commander declared after the initial losses to Hellcats. This initial denial is a defense mechanism that Jung would identify as typical when we confront aspects of our shadow, that which we do not want or cannot accept in ourselves or in our reality. But as the months passed and the Hellcat's superiority became undeniable, a deep psychic crisis began to set in among Japanese pilots. Combat statistics now showed a dramatic reversal. For every Hellcat shot down, about 6 to 7 Zeros were lost. What was once a symbol of invincibility now proved fatally vulnerable. How would you feel if what you considered an extension of your very being, a manifestation of your deepest identity, suddenly proved fragile, surpassable? How would you react to seeing your sense of invincibility shattered in the skies you once dominated? If you're watching this video and have experienced a deep identity crisis, perhaps you can understand a little of the psychological abyss that opened up for these men. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, would later write in his memoirs, "It was as if the gods had abandoned us. The sky that once belonged to us now became our tomb." This language, laden with religious symbolism, reveals the spiritual dimension of the crisis. It was not just a tactical or strategic defeat, it was a cosmological collapse, what Jung would call a breakdown of the divine order in the psyche. Let us know in the comments what you think about how you would react if you were in the shoes of these pilots, confronted with a reality that completely challenges your deepest beliefs. The journey we are about to explore in the next segments of this video will take us through the darkest corners of the human psyche when confronted with the collapse of its most fundamental certainties. We will see how some Japanese pilots managed to integrate this new reality, while others were consumed by it, culminating in the extreme phenomenon of the kamikazes, the last and most desperate attempt to transcend material inferiority through spiritual sacrifice. As 1943 progressed, the presence of Hellcats in the Pacific skies became increasingly dominant. The Marianas, Philippines, Iwo Jima, theaters of operation that once witnessed Japanese supremacy, now transformed into scenarios of a dramatic reversal of air power. To understand the depth of this psychological transformation, we need to examine how Japanese pilots experienced this transition. Pilot Tadashi Nakajima, who survived the war and later shared his memories, described his first encounter with a Hellcat. "He shouldn't have been able to make that turn. No American aircraft could keep up with my Zero in a tight turn. But he not only followed me, he started closing the distance. In that moment, I felt something I had never experienced in combat: doubt." This seemingly simple doubt represents what Jung would call a fissure in the dominant complex, that psychic structure that organizes our experience and defines our identity. For pilots who had completely integrated the mythology of the invincible Zero, this fissure was potentially devastating. Military historian Saburo Sakai documented how, after the first significant defeats to the Hellcats, some veteran pilots began reporting disturbing dreams, images of Zeros with melting wings, of endless falls, of ancestors turning their backs. In Jungian terms, these dreams represented the unconscious attempting to process and integrate a reality unacceptable to the conscious ego. In psychology and religion, Jung explores how symbols of falling or abandonment frequently emerge when fundamental psychic structures begin to disintegrate. Technically, the confrontation between the Zero and the Hellcat was unequal in crucial aspects. The Hellcat, with its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, generated almost twice the power of the Zero's Sakai engine. It had armor protecting the pilot and vital systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 6.50 caliber machine guns against the Zero's 2 machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. These technical differences translated into a brutal psychological reality. What was once a perfect extension of the pilot's being now proved inadequate, obsolete. American technology was 5 years ahead of us, but our leadership refused to accept this truth, wrote aeronautical engineer Jiro Horikoshi, creator of the Zero, in his memoirs. This collective denial perfectly illustrates the Jungian concept of psychic inflation. When a group or individual identifies so completely with an archetype, in this case that of the invincible warrior, that it loses contact with objective reality. The response of Japanese naval authorities to the growing crisis was to intensify the spiritual and ideological training of pilots, sometimes at the expense of technical training. Shinto ceremonies before missions became more elaborate, amulets and talismans more common in cockpits. Jung would observe this phenomenon as an attempt at symbolic compensation. When material means fail, spiritual rituals are intensified as a way to rebalance the psyche. Meanwhile, at advanced American bases, Hellcat pilots developed specific tactics to exploit the Zero's vulnerabilities. Never get into a turning fight with a Zero, American combat manuals instructed. Use your superior speed, dive, attack, and climb away. This rational and adaptive approach contrasted sharply with the tactical rigidity that began to characterize Japanese naval aviation, illustrating what Jung would describe as different psychological types responding to a crisis. A notable case of survival and adaptation was that of pilot Minoru Genda. Recognizing the Hellcat's superiority, Genda developed new tactics that emphasized coordinated group attacks, attempting to compensate for the Zero's individual deficiencies with numerical superiority and coordination. "We can no longer duel with them like samurai," he reportedly told his subordinates. "We must fight like wolves in a pack." This adaptation represents what Jung would call a process of partial individuation, the integration of aspects of the shadow, in this case the acceptance of vulnerability, to achieve a more complete and realistic perspective. If you're enjoying this content about deep psychology in historical contexts, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next videos exploring other fascinating aspects of the human psyche in extreme situations. As 1944 approached, the reality of the Hellcat's superiority became inescapable. In the Mariana Islands, in June of that year, what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot occurred when Hellcats shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day, while losing only a few dozen. This devastating disproportion represented more than a military defeat. It was the materialization of the collapse of an entire psychic mythology. The disaster in the Marianas marked a turning point not only in the war, but in the collective psyche of Japanese pilots. The statistics are revealing. By the end of 1944, the loss ratio had reached an alarming 10 zeros for every Hellcat shot down. Even more devastating was the loss of veteran pilots, those who had built the Zero's mythology in the early years of the war. In their place, young pilots with increasingly reduced training were sent into combat, many with fewer than 100 flight hours, compared to 500 or more hours for American pilots. This disparity created what Jung would call an archetypal rupture in the collective consciousness of Japanese naval aviation. The archetype of the warrior hero, so central to the pilot's identity, could no longer be sustained by external reality. When this happens, Jung teaches us that the psyche seeks compensation, often through extreme polarization. It is here that we begin to observe the phenomenon that would culminate in the kamikaze strategy. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, confronted with the growing inferiority of his air forces in the Philippines, proposed in October 1944 what would have been unthinkable just 2 years prior: deliberate suicide attack missions. "Our spirits, imbued with the purity of the samurai, can destroy an entire fleet of enemy ships," he declared in his famous speech to the remaining pilots. "A single plane, a single life, one ship sunk. This is the divine calculus of war." In Jungian terms, this transformation represents a fascinating phenomenon. When the ego can no longer maintain its identification with a positive archetype, the invincible warrior, it can, in extreme circumstances, identify with its opposite, in this case, the archetype of the martyr or sacrifice. Jung would call this enantiodromia, the tendency of any extreme psychological position to eventually transform into its opposite. The accounts of survivors who witnessed the transition to the kamikaze strategy reveal the profound psychological transformation underway. The young pilots who volunteered for the Special Attack Corps seemed possessed by an almost mystical fervor, wrote Lieutenant Kano, a flight instructor who survived the war. Their faces displayed a disturbing serenity, as if they were already partially in the other world. This description evokes what Jung, in Psychology and Alchemy, identifies as a state of nigredo, the alchemical phase of dissolution and putrefaction necessary before any deep transformation. The kamikaze pilots, unable to maintain identification with the victorious hero, transformed their impending defeat into transcendence through self-sacrifice. The inability to win as warriors transformed into the ability to transcend as martyrs. A particularly revealing aspect of this transformation was the change in pre-mission rituals. Kamikaze pilots participated in elaborate ceremonies that symbolized their death in life. They cut locks of hair to send to family, drank sake from ceremonial cups, and received a rising sun flag to tie to their foreheads. Jung would identify these as rites of passage, symbolic processes that facilitate the transition from one psychic state to another. Ironically, this extreme transformation of Japanese collective consciousness coincided with technical improvements to the Zero. The A6M8 model, with a more powerful engine and greater armor, began production in 1945. However, these improvements came too late to alter the course of the war or the psychological destiny of its pilots. As Jung observes in his works, when a psychic complex reaches its breaking point, even positive material changes rarely manage to reverse the ongoing transformation process. The effectiveness of kamikaze attacks is a subject of historical debate. Statistically, approximately 1 in 5 attacks resulted in significant damage to American ships, with about 50 vessels sunk and 300 damaged at the cost of nearly 4,000 lives of young Japanese pilots. This macabre efficiency represents what Jung would call sacrifice to Moloch, the offering of lives to a devouring archetype that promises salvation through self-destruction. For those pilots who did not become kamikazes but continued to face Hellcats in increasingly unequal conventional combat, the psychological reality was equally devastating. "We flew knowing we would not return," one pilot wrote in his diary, found after the war. "The only choice was how to die, not if we would die." Tell us in the comments, can you imagine such extreme psychological pressure? How do you think you would react in a situation where all options seem to lead to destruction? What makes this story particularly significant for a Jungian understanding of the human psyche is how it illustrates the tension between the opposites that inhabit our consciousness. Jung believed that psychic health depended on the ability to maintain a dynamic relationship between opposing forces, life and death, victory and defeat, self and shadow. When this dynamic tension collapses, as it did for many Japanese pilots, the result is often extreme polarization. In this case, total identification with the archetype of sacrifice. As 1945 progressed, the Pacific skies became increasingly hostile for any Japanese pilot who dared to confront them. The Hellcat had been complemented by the F4U Corsair and the P-51 Mustang, creating a trio of aerial predators against which the aging Zero had little chance. Advanced Japanese bases, once protected by air superiority, were now exposed to constant bombing. The lack of fuel and spare parts made it increasingly difficult to keep even the reduced fleet of aircraft operational. In this context of material collapse, A fascinating psychological phenomenon occurred that Jung would have recognized immediately: the intensification of spiritual and religious symbolism. Diaries and letters from pilots of this final period of the war are filled with references to visions, premonitions, and mystical experiences. "Yesterday, during the flight, I saw my ancestors in the clouds waving to me," a young pilot wrote in his diary a week before failing to return from a mission. Jung, in his work Symbols of Transformation, observes how in moments of extreme psychic pressure, the human mind frequently resorts to transcendent symbols as a way to find meaning when external reality becomes unbearable. Japanese pilots, confronted with inescapable technological and material defeat, intensified their search for meaning on the spiritual plane. A particularly illustrative case is that of Lieutenant Yohei Hinoki, a veteran pilot who survived the war despite severe injuries. In his memoirs, he describes how, after seeing almost his entire squadron decimated by Hellcats, he began to have recurring dreams of a golden dragon devouring the sun. Jung would interpret this image as a symbolic representation of the ongoing process of psychic dissolution, the sun, a central symbol of Japanese identity, being consumed by primordial forces beyond conscious control. The psychological impact of the Hellcat's superiority extended far beyond individual pilots, affecting the entire structure of Japanese naval command. Documents from the Naval High Command reveal a growing division between those who still insisted on the possibility of victory through Japanese spirit and those who recognized the material reality of impending defeat. This schism reflects what Jung would call a conflict between the persona, the social mask that insists on invincibility, and the shadow, the repressed recognition of vulnerability and defeat. Meanwhile, on the American side, the perception of Japanese pilots also underwent a significant transformation. Intelligence reports and diaries of American pilots show an evolution of the enemy's image, from the feared and respected adversary of the early years to a more complex view that blended admiration for courage and perplexity at what many considered irrational fanaticism of the kamikazes. American pilot Edward Butch O'Hare, one of the first aces to face Zeros, wrote, "They fly as if they have no fear of death. At first, that made them lethal. Now, it makes them predictable." This observation perfectly captures the psychological transformation underway. What was once a strength, the willingness for self-sacrifice, now became a tactically exploited weakness. Changes in Japanese tactics during this final period reveal desperate attempts at psychological adaptation to the new reality. A notable innovation was the development of the bento tactic, name derived from Japanese lunchboxes, where formations of Zeros attempted to swarm a single Hellcat, sacrificing several planes to shoot down a single adversary. This statistically disastrous approach reveals what Jung would call psychic inflation, when the psychological need for success becomes so intense that it completely distorts rational assessment. For the few veteran pilots who survived until the final stages of the war, the psychological process was particularly complex. Many had witnessed the complete transition, from absolute dominance to devastating inferiority. Captain Masatake Okumiya, who would later co-write the book Zero, described this process as watching the sunset on our aerial empire. The metaphor of the sunset is particularly significant in Jungian terms, representing the movement of consciousness into the unconscious, from the known to the unknown. Jung's Man and His Symbols offers a valuable perspective on how entire cultures can experience collective psychic transformations during periods of crisis. The case of the Japanese pilots perfectly illustrates this process. The collective identification with the Zero as a symbol of technological and spiritual superiority, followed by the disintegration of this identification when confronted with an incompatible material reality, and finally, the psychic reorientation towards new symbols and meanings, in this case, sacrifice and transcendence through death. Share this video with a friend or family member interested in military history or deep psychology. In the next segment, we will explore the long-term psychological reverberations of this transformation, both in post-war Japanese culture and in our collective understanding of the human psyche under extreme pressure. When the last Zeros were seen in the skies over Japan during the final months of the war, they were no longer the same ones that had dominated the Pacific 4 years earlier. Not only technically outmatched, but burdened with transformed symbolism that reflected the psychological journey of their pilots and the nation they represented. The confrontation between the Zero and the Hellcat was not just a battle of machines and tactics, but a profound psychic drama that Jung would have recognized as a complete alchemical process. From exaltation to nigredo, from dissolution to the desperate attempt at coagulation through sacrifice. The final statistics of the air war in the Pacific are striking. Of approximately 10,500 Zeros produced, almost 10,000 were lost. The Hellcat, in turn, claimed 5,163 confirmed aerial victories, becoming the most successful aircraft in American naval history. For every Hellcat lost in aerial combat, 19 Japanese aircraft were shot down. These cold numbers conceal a devastating human reality. Thousands of young pilots, many with insufficient training, sent on missions from which they had no realistic chance of returning. Japan's surrender in August 1945 marked the formal end of the conflict, but the psychological impact of this experience resonated far beyond the war's conclusion. For the few veteran Zero pilots who survived, the process of psychological integration of this experience was profoundly transformative. Sabaru Sakai, one of the surviving aces, wrote in his memoirs, "I had to die to myself twice, first when I realized we were not invincible, and again when my country surrendered." This dual psychic death perfectly illustrates what Jung would describe as the process of dissolution and reconstruction of identity. For Sakai and other survivors, the post-war period required what Jung would call a forced individuation, the need to recognize and integrate aspects of the shadow, vulnerability, fallibility that had been projected or denied during the war years. For Japanese society as a whole, the symbolism of the Zero, from supremacy to defeat, became part of a broader collective process of psychic transformation. As Jung observes in aspects of the contemporary drama, entire societies can experience processes of archetypal transformation similar to those of individuals. Japan's rapid post-war modernization, with its emphasis on technological and industrial excellence, can be partially understood as an attempt at psychological reconciliation with the traumatic experience of American technological superiority symbolized by the Hellcat. Interestingly, the American designers of the Hellcat never considered it a revolutionary aircraft, but simply a pragmatic response to a specific problem. Edward Heinemann, one of the project's lead engineers, commented after the war, "We weren't trying to create a legend, just an aircraft our guys could bring home." This difference in perspective, American pragmatism versus the almost religious symbolism attributed to aircraft by the Japanese, reflects what Jung would identify as different typological attitudes toward material reality. Decades after the war, military historians and psychologists continue to study the kamikaze phenomenon as an extreme case of collective psychological adaptation. Modern analyses suggest that the phenomenon cannot be reduced to simple fanaticism or brainwashing, as often portrayed in post-war Western literature. Instead, it represented a complex adaptive response to an unbearable material reality, mediated by specific cultural and psychological structures. In his book The Myth of the Eternal Return, Mircea Eliade, a contemporary of Jung and a scholar of comparative religions, offers a complementary perspective. Traditional cultures frequently respond to historical traumas by resorting to mythical patterns of sacrifice and regeneration. The kamikazes can be understood through this lens as an attempt to transform historical defeat into mythical victory, linear time into sacred time, individual death into collective renewal. A particularly poignant aspect of this story is the fate of the surviving Zeros after the war. Most were destroyed as part of demilitarization efforts, some were taken as trophies to American museums, and only a handful remained in Japan. One of these, restored in the 1970s, made its first post-war flight piloted by Masahiro Matsuda, the son of a Zero pilot killed in combat. Matsuda described the experience as flying with my father's ghost, an image that perfectly captures the Jungian concept of psychic constellation, when an external object or experience activates deep emotional complexes related to parental and ancestral figures. For us, contemporary observers, the story of the confrontation between the Zero and the Hellcat offers valuable lessons about the intersection of technology, psychology, and culture. As Jung frequently emphasized, technological advancements are rarely accompanied by corresponding psychological development. The tragedy of the Japanese pilots illustrates the dangers of excessive identification with symbols of technological superiority and how this identification can hinder adaptation when material reality changes. The problem of modern man, wrote Jung, is that he believes he masters nature through technology, without realizing how that same technology can master his spirit. This observation finds a disturbing echo in the experience of Zero pilots, who went from absolute confidence in their technical superiority to an equally absolute capitulation in the face of their inferiority. If you've made it this far in the video, give us a like and subscribe for more deep dives into historical moments seen through the lens of Jungian psychology. May the history of these men, both Japanese and American, who fought and died in the Pacific skies, teach us about the complexity of the human psyche when confronted with its limits. As Jung reminded us, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Perhaps the true legacy of the confrontation between the Zero and the Hellcat is a lesson about the dangers of technological hubris and the need to integrate our limitations as an essential part of our humanity. We are not gods in the skies, but human beings capable of both great ingenuity and tragic failures of perception. The final quote belongs to Carl Jung himself. "Where there is light, there is also shadow. What appears as light to some, to others may appear as darkness." In the skies of the Pacific between 1942 and 1945, this truth manifested literally and tragically, as two worldviews, two cultures, two approaches to technology and war collided in the heights, leaving a legacy that still illuminates the depths of the human psyche under extreme pressure.